Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A journey of dreams and doubt. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning, the type of day that seemed to promise little more than the mundane rituals of life. But for Marcus Carter, it held the weight of a dream that was about to come true. At the bustling airport, with its labyrinth of terminals and endless lines, Marcus stood with an expression of nervous anticipation on his face. His fingers gripped the worn straps of his backpack as though they were the last lifelines to the reality he had worked so hard to reach. In the crowded space of the airport, the sounds of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and distant public address announcements created a constant hum. But to Marcus, everything felt distant, as though he were standing in a separate world entirely. His eyes were fixed on the check-in counter ahead, his thoughts focused entirely on the flight ahead, the flight that would take him halfway across the world to the International STEM competition, a global event where the brightest young minds from all over the world would compete. For Marcus, this was no ordinary competition. It was the culmination of years of late nights, self-taught lessons, and endless hours spent in libraries and computer labs. It was the chance to prove to himself and everyone else that he belonged among the best. He glanced down at the ticket in his hand, his fingers brushing over the bold, black text that read International STEM Competition, Flight to New York. It felt surreal. A few months ago, Marcus had been just another high school student in a small, underfunded school in the heart of Brooklyn. Now, he was on the cusp of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It was a ticket to something greater, something bigger than he had ever dared to imagine. "Excuse me, sir." A voice interrupted Marcus's reverie. It was a woman in her late 30s, dressed in a neat airline uniform. She was standing by the counter, calling him over. Marcus snapped back to attention and quickly shuffled toward her. She was behind a desk with a computer, her face neutral as she glanced at him and then at his ticket. "ID and passport, please," she said, her tone brisk but not unfriendly. He handed her both items, his hands now slightly trembling. This was it, the moment where everything he had worked for would either come to fruition or fall apart. Marcus had never flown before, and he was filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. This trip represented everything: his passion for science, his dreams for the future, and most importantly, the chance to show his family, his community, and himself that he was more than the odds that had been stacked against him. The woman looked over his documents, then turned back to her computer, typing furiously. Marcus watched as she scanned the screen, her face unreadable. His nerves flared up again. "Everything in order, Mr. Carter," she said after a long pause. "But there's a problem with your boarding pass." Marcus's heart sank. He had checked and double-checked everything, his paperwork, his passport, his ticket. There was no way something could be wrong. But the woman was already tapping away on her keyboard, her gaze now more focused on the screen than on him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice now more curt. "It seems there's been an issue with your ticket. It has been flagged in the system." Marcus's mind raced. "Flagged? What does that mean?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure, but inside, he was spiraling. The woman didn't respond immediately. She glanced at him once more, then spoke again. "I'm going to have to refer this to the supervisor," she said, gesturing toward a doorway at the back of the counter. "Please, just let me board," Marcus said, his voice now a little more desperate. "I've worked so hard for this. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I can't miss it." Her expression softened slightly, but she didn't budge. "I understand," she said, but the finality in her voice told him otherwise. Marcus stepped aside and waited anxiously, trying to make sense of what was happening. The minutes ticked by painfully slow, his palms becoming clammy with the weight of uncertainty. Every person who passed by seemed to have a destination, a purpose. But he, Marcus, was caught in limbo. His eyes darted from the departure boards, where flights to various destinations flashed in bright colors, to the gate where the airplane that was supposed to take him to his dreams waited in silence. After what felt like an eternity, the airline supervisor, a tall, middle-aged man wearing a dark suit, approached the counter. His face was set in a stern expression as he glanced down at Marcus's ticket, then at the screen. Without a word, he signaled for the woman to step away. The two exchanged a brief but tense conversation, and Marcus caught a few words that made his stomach tighten: incomplete clearance and not approved. "Mr. Carter," the supervisor said, turning to face him with a mixture of frustration and indifference. "Your ticket has been flagged due to a discrepancy. It's been marked as invalid for boarding." Marcus's mouth went dry. He was sure he hadn't heard him right. "What do you mean? How can my ticket be invalid?" I'm sorry, but you'll need to leave the boarding area," the supervisor interrupted, his voice colder now. "But I've worked so hard to get here," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "Please, I need to be on that flight." The supervisor didn't look at him as he turned and started walking away, but the words that left his mouth cut through the air: "You'll have to make other arrangements." Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. It didn't seem real. He couldn't understand what had just happened. His dreams, the future he had worked so hard for, were slipping away from him. The hustle of the airport around him seemed to fade into the background. The sounds of passengers hurrying past, the murmurs of conversations, and the steady rhythm of rolling luggage were all drowned out by the deafening silence in his own head. The realization that he had just been denied the chance to board hit him with the force of a freight train. As he stood there, his vision blurred with the sting of tears he refused to shed, Marcus didn't know what to do. His first instinct was to turn around and leave, to give up and go home. But something deeper, something in the core of his being, wouldn't allow him to do that. "No," he whispered to himself. "I won't give up." And just as he was about to make his way toward the exit, a voice called out from behind him. A voice that would soon change everything. It was the last thing he expected. The voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly warm. But it carried with it an authority that drew Marcus's attention immediately. He turned around, still confused and uncertain, and there, standing just beyond the security checkpoint, was the CEO of the airline himself, Jonathan Stevens. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan said with a reassuring smile, "I believe we've made a mistake." Little did Marcus know, this encounter would set off a series of events that would completely transform his life. What started as an airport misfortune would quickly turn into a remarkable journey, a story of resilience, kindness, and unexpected twists. But at that moment, all Marcus could do was stare in disbelief. This, he realized, was not the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. Marcus stood there, stunned, his mind still racing to comprehend what had just happened. The bustling airport, once a sea of hurried travelers and distant announcements, now felt like a foggy backdrop to an event that seemed too surreal to be real. He had been denied boarding, his dream slipping out of his grasp, and now, the CEO of the airline himself was standing before him, his eyes focused and intent. For a moment, Marcus was uncertain whether this was some kind of dream, a fevered hallucination brought on by the crushing disappointment. "Mr. Carter," Jonathan Stevens repeated, his voice calm yet commanding. "I believe we've made a mistake." Marcus's mouth went dry as he tried to piece together what was happening. He had been ready to leave the airport in defeat, to return to his life of uncertainty and struggle. But this encounter was not part of the script he had imagined. He was used to obstacles, to setbacks. Growing up in Brooklyn, he had learned to face adversity with determination. Yet this was something entirely different. Something that, even in his most optimistic moments, he had never imagined. The CEO took a step closer, his demeanor warm but assertive. "I'm Jonathan Stevens. I oversee this airline's operations, and I wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced today. There's been a mix-up with your ticket, something that shouldn't have happened, and I intend to get to the bottom of it." Marcus could hardly process the words. The supervisor's cold dismissal still echoed in his ears, the finality of it all hanging like a weight over him. But here, in front of him, was a man who, by all accounts, should have been far removed from his world, a man of power and influence, with the kind of authority that seemed to belong to another realm altogether. How could this be real? How could the man standing in front of him even know his name, let alone care?
Thank you, Marcus stammered, unsure how to respond.
But I don't understand.
What do you mean?
My ticket was flagged. The supervisor said it was invalid.
What's going on?
Jonathan Stevens smiled reassuringly, his eyes kind but serious.
It's a long story, Mr. Carter.
But the short version is that someone in our system made a mistake, an unfortunate one, and I'm deeply sorry for the confusion. Your ticket was mistakenly flagged due to a technical error. It's not your fault.
Marcus felt a surge of hope rise in his chest, only to be quickly quelled by the gravity of the situation. He had been on the verge of giving up, thinking that his dreams were slipping away forever, only to now hear the CEO of the airline speak to him with such compassion. And yet, as hopeful as it sounded, the reality was still sinking in. The ticket had been flagged. He had been turned away. He could feel the weight of the missed opportunity pressing against him, like a shadow that wouldn't lift.
But, Marcus began, his voice uncertain, if my ticket was flagged, then, how can I still board the flight?
It's already boarding.
I'm not sure what else can be done. The supervisor seemed pretty set on the idea that I wouldn't be going anywhere.
Jonathan Stevens's face softened, his expression filled with a quiet understanding.
That's precisely why I'm here, he said gently.
We have a private jet that can take you to New York tonight if you're willing to accept the offer.
I understand it's not the same as flying commercial, but I want to make this right for you. You've earned this opportunity, and no mistake in our system should stand in the way of your dreams.
The words struck Marcus like a thunderbolt.
A private jet?
His mind reeled.
A private jet was not something someone like him, someone from his background, had ever imagined as a possibility. He had worked hard, tirelessly, to make it to this point, to fight through the limitations of his circumstances and the societal expectations of who he was supposed to be. But a private jet? That was beyond comprehension. That was a luxury reserved for a different class of people, a different kind of life.
Marcus's throat tightened.
He felt the sting of tears welling up, but he swallowed them down. This wasn't the time for weakness. This was the moment that could change everything for him.
Are you serious? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he were afraid the words would disappear if he said them too loudly.
Jonathan Stevens nodded, his smile now more confident.
Absolutely.
We'll make sure you get to the competition, no matter what it takes. I'll have everything arranged for you. You've earned this, Marcus. I don't want you to miss it because of something that wasn't your fault.
For a moment, Marcus was lost for words.
He stood there, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had always known that life was about overcoming obstacles, that the road to success was never smooth. But this moment, this kind of kindness, this unexpected turn of events, was something he hadn't been prepared for. He had always thought that the road to success was a solitary journey, that it was just him against the world. But now, for the first time in his life, he was seeing that sometimes, people cared. Sometimes, there was help when you least expected it. But Marcus hesitated, looking down at his ticket in his hand, still unable to fully process the situation. What about the competition? Will I still make it in time? I've been working for this moment for years, and I can't afford to miss it.
You'll make it, Jonathan assured him.
We'll make sure of it. The private jet is already on standby, and we'll get you there with plenty of time to spare. I won't let you miss your moment, Marcus. A wave of relief washed over Marcus, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For a moment, he simply stood there, unsure of what to say next. The enormity of the situation was still settling in his mind. A private jet? The opportunity of a lifetime? The chance to compete with the best minds in the world? Before he could speak again, Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him in the present. I know this may be overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. This isn't just about fixing a mistake, it's about giving you what you deserve. You've worked incredibly hard to get to this point. And it's time for the world to see your potential. This is your moment. Marcus nodded, the weight of Jonathan's words sinking in. He had heard so many people tell him that his dreams were too big, that he was aiming too high. But here was a man, a person in power, telling him that his dreams mattered, that he deserved to reach for the stars. It was an affirmation that Marcus had rarely heard in his life, and it was exactly what he needed. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice finally steady. "Thank you for this. I don't know what to say." Jonathan smiled once more. "You don't need to say anything. Just take your seat on that plane, Marcus. You've already said everything through your actions. Now, go show the world what you're capable of." And with that, Marcus found himself walking with Jonathan through the terminal, past the crowd of travelers who continued to bustle around them, oblivious to the pivotal moment unfolding in their midst. As they made their way to the private jet, Marcus could hardly believe that this was real. The man who had once felt so distant, so unreachable, had made it his mission to ensure that Marcus's dreams wouldn't be derailed by an airline's mistake. As they stepped onto the jet, Marcus looked out the window and watched as the airport became smaller, fading into the distance. The adrenaline that had once been a nervous flutter in his chest now surged through him in a wave of anticipation. The competition, the opportunity, the future, it was all within his reach now. And as the plane ascended into the sky, Marcus couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. As the jet soared through the clouds, the world below gradually faded into a patchwork of green and gray, the sprawling cityscape giving way to endless stretches of land. Marcus sat back in the plush leather seat, his fingers still gripping the armrests as if holding on to something solid in the midst of the dizzying turn his life had just taken. The hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the cabin offered a strange sense of tranquility, but inside him, a storm was still brewing. He couldn't fully believe that this was happening, that he, Marcus Carter from Brooklyn, was on a private jet, heading to one of the most prestigious STEM competitions in the world. Everything he had worked for, every hour spent poring over textbooks, every late night spent in front of his computer, now felt surreal. For a moment, he allowed himself to close his eyes and breathe deeply, as if to fully absorb the magnitude of the opportunity before him. But even as he sat there, the weight of the journey ahead kept him grounded. The international STEM competition wasn't just a contest, it was a moment of reckoning. A chance to prove that his dreams weren't just fantasies, that they were worthy of a place in the world's most brilliant minds. He had spent so many years trying to find a path that would lead him out of the challenges that came with growing up in an underfunded school, facing the prejudice that often came with being a young black teenager in a city like Brooklyn. His hard work had earned him a spot at the competition, but now, sitting in the lap of luxury, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of imposter syndrome creeping in. Was he really worthy of this? Did he truly belong at the table with these future leaders, these prodigies who had access to more resources and opportunities than he had ever dreamed of? His mind raced as he thought about the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his mother, working long hours at a local diner to keep the family afloat, sacrificing everything for his education. He thought about the late nights spent in the school's makeshift computer lab, the only place he could access the technology to complete his projects. There had been so many moments when he felt like giving up, when the weight of his circumstances seemed too heavy to bear. Yet, here he was, on a private jet, heading toward the future he had once thought was beyond his reach. The flight attendants moved quietly through the cabin, offering him a drink, but he politely declined, still lost in thought. He was grateful for the gesture, but his mind wasn't on the luxury of the moment. It was on the competition, the one event that could change everything. He had been preparing for this for months, perhaps even years, but it wasn't just the academic challenge that he feared. It was the unspoken pressure that came with it, the pressure to represent not just himself, but his entire community. Marcus knew that if he succeeded, it wouldn't just be his personal victory, it would be a triumph for every young person who had ever been told they weren't enough, who had been denied access to the same opportunities that others seemed to take for granted. It was that pressure, more than anything, that made his heart race. The jet hit a patch of turbulence, and Marcus jolted slightly in his seat.
He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then pulled out his phone. There were a few messages from his mom, her words filled with encouragement and pride. She knew how much this meant to him, how much he had sacrificed for this moment. And though she had always been his greatest supporter, there was something unspoken in her messages, a hope, a prayer, that this competition would be his breakthrough, his way out of the cycle of struggle that had defined so much of their lives. As the plane continued its journey, Marcus's thoughts shifted. He thought about the people he had met during the lead-up to the competition, other students, their families, the mentors who had given him advice along the way. It was a world so different from the one he had known. The competition would bring together brilliant young minds from across the globe, many of whom had access to resources he could only dream of. He had worked hard to close the gap, to ensure that his lack of resources didn't define his ability to succeed. But now, as he thought about the state-of-the-art labs, the cutting-edge technologies the other contestants had used to prepare, a familiar sense of doubt gnawed at him. Was he really ready? Could he stand toe-to-toe with kids who had the kind of mentorship, the kind of funding, that he could only read about in articles and textbooks? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft ping of a notification on his phone. He glanced at the screen and saw that it was an email from the competition organizers. The subject line read, "Final preparation materials for the International STEM competition." His heart skipped a beat as he opened the message, scanning the contents. The email contained final details about the event, along with a list of resources available to the participants, including access to some of the most advanced technological tools available in the field. As he read through the list, his pulse quickened. There were labs with AI research platforms, high-performance computing systems, and specialized equipment for data analysis. This was exactly the kind of technology he had always dreamed of working with, tools he had only seen in online tutorials and academic journals. And now, they would be at his fingertips. Marcus's anxiety shifted, a new surge of energy filling him. He could do this. He was ready. All the preparation, all the sleepless nights, had led to this moment. He had the knowledge, the passion, and the drive. What he lacked in resources, he more than made up for in determination. He wasn't going to let anyone, or anything, deter him from this opportunity. He had earned his place here, and he was going to prove it. The rest of the flight passed in a blur as Marcus reviewed the competition materials, formulating a strategy in his mind. By the time the jet began its descent into New York, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had been given a rare gift, a second chance, not just at the competition, but at proving to the world that he had what it took to succeed, no matter the odds. And this time, he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. As the jet touched down and taxied toward the private hangar, Marcus could feel his heart beating faster. This was it. He was here. The competition was just a few hours away, and everything he had worked for was within his reach. The door to the jet opened, and Marcus stepped out onto the tarmac, his feet finally on solid ground. He looked around, taking in the sprawling cityscape of New York, the skyline a jagged silhouette against the setting sun. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to take it all in, the enormity of the opportunity, the significance of the moment. Then, without missing a beat, he straightened his shoulders, pushed aside any lingering doubts, and walked toward the future that was waiting for him. The car that had been arranged for him was already waiting, and as he settled into the back seat, the driver pulled away from the hangar and into the heart of the city. The sights and sounds of New York enveloped him, but his mind was focused entirely on the competition. This wasn't just about winning, it was about proving to himself that all the sacrifices, all the struggles, had been worth it. It was about showing the world that a kid from Brooklyn, a kid who had never had the same advantages as others, could rise to the challenge and excel. As the car weaved through the bustling streets, Marcus's thoughts turned once again to his family, to his mother, who had always been his rock, his unwavering support. She had never doubted him, never questioned his dreams, even when the world seemed to tell him he wasn't enough. Her faith in him had been the fuel that kept him going, even when the road was rough and the obstacles seemed insurmountable. And now, he would repay her. He would make her proud. The car pulled up to the towering glass building that housed the venue for the competition. It was a symbol of everything Marcus had ever dreamed of: success, achievement, and recognition. He stepped out of the car and gazed up at the building, the anticipation growing inside him. This was his moment. And he was ready. He wasn't going to let anything stop him now. As he entered the building, he could already feel the weight of the eyes on him. Young prodigies, geniuses, the best and brightest from around the world, were gathered here for the same reason Marcus was, because they had something to prove. He could feel their energy, their determination, and yet, in the midst of it all, Marcus felt a quiet sense of calm settle within him. This wasn't just about the competition. It was about proving that no matter where you came from, no matter what odds you faced, you had the power to change your destiny. And Marcus Carter was ready to do just that. Marcus stood in the grand lobby of the competition venue, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the place. The polished marble floors gleamed beneath his shoes, reflecting the bright, sterile lights that seemed to cast everything in a futuristic glow. People in sharp suits and designer clothes walked briskly, their faces filled with the kind of confidence that Marcus had never seen up close. He felt out of place here, like a speck in an ocean of brilliance, but the energy in the air was intoxicating. It was a tangible buzz, a sense that the very air was charged with potential, with futures that would be shaped in the coming days. He looked around, his eyes darting from group to group, catching snippets of conversation in languages he didn't understand. Young people, just like him, but with a world of difference. Some were seated in clusters, their eyes glued to the screens of their laptops, analyzing data, preparing for the challenges ahead. Others were talking animatedly with mentors and advisors, seeking last-minute advice and offering up their own thoughts. Every one of them seemed to belong here. Every one of them seemed to fit the mold of the gifted, the extraordinary, the future leaders of the world. And yet, despite his discomfort, Marcus stood tall. His back straightened. He belonged here too. He had earned his spot, after all. He had worked relentlessly for this moment, fought through every obstacle that had been put in his path. This was his time, and he wasn't about to let anyone make him feel like an outsider. As he walked further into the venue, Marcus noticed a group of young competitors huddled around a table, discussing a problem set. He couldn't help but overhear their conversation, and what he heard made his stomach twist. They were talking about cutting-edge technologies and advanced algorithms, topics that were well beyond what he had studied. He had spent countless hours learning everything he could on his own, but these students, many of whom came from prestigious schools with massive budgets for STEM education, seemed to be discussing problems that Marcus had never even encountered. The weight of their knowledge pressed down on him. Were they going to be able to solve problems that he couldn't even understand? Doubt crept back into his mind, threatening to undo the resolve he had built on the private jet. His heart pounded as he thought about the upcoming challenges. Was he truly prepared? What if his best wasn't good enough? What if all the hours he had spent studying in the dimly lit corners of libraries couldn't measure up to the polished, sophisticated skills of the students around him? What if he had already reached the peak of what he could achieve, and now, standing in this space, he would be exposed as an imposter? But then, in the middle of his spiraling thoughts, Marcus remembered something. He remembered his mother's words, the encouragement she had given him, even when they had nothing. She had always told him that his worth wasn't measured by what others had, but by the fire within him. "Keep pushing, Marcus," she had said countless times. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do. You define your future." It was these words, more than anything else, that had carried him to this moment. He wasn't here because of some special privilege or access. He was here because he had worked harder than anyone else, because he had refused to let his circumstances define him. With a deep breath, Marcus pushed his doubts aside. He wasn't here to compete against anyone else. He was here to compete against himself. To push the limits of his own potential. And he would do whatever it took to prove that the obstacles he had overcome were not a weakness, but the very thing that made him stronger. The competition kicked off with a series of technical challenges, each designed to test the participants' ability to think critically, solve complex problems, and apply their knowledge in real time. The first task was daunting, a data analysis problem involving several terabytes of information, meant to test the competitors' understanding of machine learning and artificial intelligence. Marcus sat at his workstation, staring at the screen in front of him, the data overwhelming at first glance. But he didn't let panic set in. He had faced far worse in the quiet hours of his late-night studies, moments when the weight of the work seemed insurmountable, when the pressure felt like it might break him. But he had always pushed through. He scanned the data carefully, breaking it down piece by piece, focusing on the patterns and trends that others might overlook. It wasn't about trying to be the fastest or the smartest, it was about patience and persistence. Marcus knew that the key to solving problems like these was staying calm and thinking logically. Slowly but surely, the pieces began to fall into place. The code he wrote to analyze the data seemed to click, and the answers began to emerge, the complex web of information untangling in front of him. Hours passed in a blur, but Marcus was completely immersed in the task at hand, his mind sharp and focused, driven by a single goal: to finish strong. By the time the first challenge ended, Marcus felt a wave of satisfaction wash over him. He hadn't just finished the task, he had conquered it. When the judges announced the results, Marcus was stunned to see his name listed among the top competitors. It wasn't just that he had solved the problem, it was the way he had approached it. He had been calm, methodical, and precise, qualities that set him apart from some of the others who had rushed through the problem without fully understanding the nuances. The next few days were a blur of challenges, each one more difficult than the last. There were moments when Marcus doubted himself, when the pressure of the competition weighed heavy on his shoulders. But each time, he remembered his purpose. He remembered that he wasn't just here for himself, but for everyone who had ever believed in him. He wasn't just competing to win, he was competing to prove that hard work, resilience, and determination could take him to places that were once thought impossible. As the final day of the competition approached, the energy in the air shifted. The atmosphere was no longer filled with the eager chatter of students solving problems and bouncing ideas off one another. Now, it was filled with the weight of anticipation. Everyone knew that this was the moment that would determine the winner, the moment that would define their future. Marcus could feel it in the air, a palpable tension that gripped him as he walked into the room where the final challenge would be held. The problem was the most complex yet: designing a sustainable energy solution for a city on the brink of an environmental disaster. It wasn't just a test of technical knowledge, it was a test of creativity, of the ability to think outside the box. Marcus felt a flicker of doubt rise in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life, even if he hadn't known it. The world needed new solutions to its most pressing problems, and Marcus was determined to be part of that change. He dove into the problem with everything he had, drawing on the knowledge he had gained from years of self-study and practical experience. He thought about the communities he had grown up in, the neighborhoods that had been neglected, the people who had been left behind, and it gave him the fuel he needed. This wasn't just about winning a competition. This was about creating a better future for everyone, especially those who had been forgotten. As the clock ticked down, Marcus finalized his proposal, a comprehensive plan that combined renewable energy sources, community-based initiatives, and advanced technologies to address the environmental crisis. It was bold, unconventional, and deeply personal. It was everything he had learned, everything he had fought for, distilled into a single solution. When the judges called time, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace. He had done his best. He had given everything to the competition, and now it was out of his hands. He watched as the other contestants submitted their proposals, their eyes filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. Everyone had worked hard, but Marcus knew, deep down, that this was his moment. He had poured his heart into this challenge, and he knew that the solution he had crafted was more than just a collection of data points and algorithms. It was a reflection of everything he stood for, everything he believed in. The judges took their time, deliberating carefully over each proposal. The room was silent, the only sound the soft murmur of voices in the background. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the results were announced.
The first place winner would be Marcus Carter. A roar of applause filled the room as Marcus's heart surged with disbelief. He had done it. He had won. The dream that had once felt so distant, so unreachable, was now his reality. And as the trophy was handed to him, as the cheers of his fellow competitors filled the air, Marcus realized that this wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for everyone who had ever doubted him, everyone who had told him that he didn't belong. This was for his family, for his community, and for every young person who had ever been told they weren't enough. In that moment, standing on the stage with the world watching, Marcus Carter understood something he had never fully grasped before. He wasn't just competing for himself. He was competing for the future, his future, and the future of everyone who dared to dream. And now, the world was his to shape. The applause echoed in Marcus's ears as he stood at the center of the stage, the golden trophy gleaming in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration flooding his senses. For a moment, everything around him seemed to blur, the sounds and lights fading as his mind raced to comprehend what had just happened. He had won. He had truly won. The victory wasn't just for him, though. It was for everyone who had ever believed in him, everyone who had stood by his side, even when the world seemed determined to push him down. The judges, who had scrutinized his work with an air of skepticism, now smiled warmly as they congratulated him. They spoke of his innovative solution, his attention to detail, and his ability to think beyond the conventional. But in Marcus's mind, it wasn't just about the competition. It wasn't even about the recognition or the accolades. It was about the journey, the relentless drive that had carried him to this moment, despite the odds stacked against him. It was about proving that no matter where you came from, no matter what you lacked, you could always reach for something greater. As the crowd began to dissipate, and the other competitors congratulated him, Marcus felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find Jonathan Stevens, the CEO of the airline who had personally ensured his arrival at the competition. The man's expression was one of genuine pride, and for a moment, it felt like Marcus was seeing him not just as a figurehead, but as a mentor, someone who had believed in his potential when no one else had. "You did it, Marcus," Jonathan said, his voice filled with warmth. "I knew you had it in you." Marcus smiled, still in awe of the entire experience. "I never thought I would make it this far, to be honest. There were so many moments when I doubted myself, when I didn't think I belonged here. But now, standing here, I realize that everything I've been through, all the struggles, the late nights, the sacrifices, it's all been worth it." Jonathan nodded, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "That's the spirit, Marcus. The world needs more people like you. People who don't give up, who refuse to be defined by their circumstances. You've proven that with hard work and determination, anything is possible." Marcus's chest swelled with pride, but even as the words of encouragement settled in, he knew that this victory was just the beginning. The competition had opened a door for him, but the real work was still ahead. What would he do with this newfound recognition? How would he use this moment to push forward, to continue breaking barriers and making a difference? As the final ceremony wrapped up, Marcus found himself in the midst of a crowd of reporters, camera flashes going off in every direction. The competition organizers asked him a few questions, eager to hear his thoughts on the challenges he had faced and what had inspired his innovative solution. His words came easily, his passion evident as he spoke about his vision for a sustainable future, his desire to use technology to solve some of the world's most pressing problems. But beneath the surface, his mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what came next. The road to success, he knew, was never linear. This competition, this victory, wasn't the end of his journey, it was just one chapter in the story that was still being written. He had always known that the real work lay in what happened after the applause faded, after the excitement wore off. The real test would come when he had to face the challenges that came with turning ideas into reality. He had won a competition, but now it was time to change the world. And that, he understood, was a much bigger task. The following weeks passed in a blur of media interviews, speaking engagements,
and offers from universities and tech companies, all eager to secure his talent. The recognition was overwhelming, but Marcus stayed grounded, always remembering the struggles that had brought him here. He had not forgotten the long nights spent studying in his cramped apartment, the constant financial struggles, or the feeling of being underestimated by those around him. The road to success had never been easy, but now, standing at the precipice of something greater, Marcus knew that it was only the beginning of what he was truly capable of. One afternoon, after a particularly long interview with a major tech publication, Marcus sat in his hotel room, alone with his thoughts. The noise of the outside world had faded into the background as he reflected on everything that had transpired since that fateful day at the airport. He thought about the kindness of Jonathan Stevens, the man who had not only helped him reach the competition but had also become a symbol of the unexpected kindness that sometimes emerges when we least expect it. Jonathan had not just offered him a seat on a private jet, he had offered him a chance to prove to the world, and to himself, that his dreams were worth pursuing. That moment had been pivotal, and Marcus knew it would stay with him forever. He also thought about his mother, who had sacrificed so much for him to have a shot at a better life. He wished she were here to witness this victory. Though they had never had much, she had always believed in him, always pushed him to aim higher, to do more, to never let anyone tell him he couldn't achieve something. Her unwavering faith in him had been the foundation on which he built his success, and now, as he prepared for the next chapter, he promised himself that he would make her proud. He would do everything in his power to make sure that the sacrifices they had made weren't in vain. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts, and he picked it up without hesitation. It was a call he had been expecting but hadn't anticipated would come so soon. On the other end of the line was a representative from a leading tech company, offering him an internship, one that would lead to a full-time position if he performed well. The opportunity was everything he had worked for, the chance to dive into the world of technology, to learn from the best, and to contribute to the kind of projects that could change the world. But as Marcus listened to the details, his mind wandered. The offer was tempting, of course, but it wasn't the only path available to him. He thought about the way the competition had sparked a fire within him, the way it had shown him the vast potential for change that existed in the world. He realized that his victory wasn't just a personal achievement, it was a chance to make a difference on a larger scale. He could take the job, learn from industry leaders, and follow the conventional path to success. Or he could strike out on his own, build something new, and make the kind of impact he had always dreamed of. It was a difficult choice, one that would shape the direction of his life for years to come. As he hung up the phone, Marcus knew that the decision he made next would define the rest of his journey. The path he chose wasn't just about success, it was about purpose. It was about using his talents and resources to leave a legacy, to create something meaningful that would last long after he was gone. He wasn't just chasing personal achievements anymore, he was chasing a dream much larger than himself. A dream of innovation, of progress, of changing the world for the better. And with that, Marcus Carter made a decision. He wasn't going to follow the path that was already laid out for him. He wasn't going to settle for the comforts of a prestigious job in a top-tier tech company. He was going to start something of his own. He was going to use the skills, knowledge, and resources he had gained from his journey to build a company, one that focused on creating sustainable, accessible technologies for communities that were often left behind. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but it was the only road that mattered. As the months passed, Marcus worked tirelessly, pulling together a team of like-minded individuals who shared his vision. Together, they built something that would eventually revolutionize how technology could be used to solve some of the world's most pressing environmental and social challenges. They didn't have the resources of Silicon Valley or the backing of venture capitalists. What they had was a deep sense of purpose and the belief that they could change the world, one innovation at a time. And as Marcus looked back on his journey, from the nervous teenager at the airport, to the young man who stood on that stage with the world watching, he realized that the true victory wasn't the trophy. It wasn't the recognition or the accolades. It was the journey itself, the way it had transformed him, made him into someone who believed that anything was possible, as long as you were willing to fight for it.
The world had only just begun to see what Marcus Carter was capable of, and he was ready to show them.